Welcome in, everyone. We'll be getting started momentarily at the top of the hour. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Right in Time and for Less, Louisiana's Installment Purchase Market for Third-Party Financing. This is the second webinar in our Cronin Awards webinar series. And today we'll be taking a closer look at the Silver Award winner for 2021. So thank you all for joining us. We're glad you're here. Our 2021 Cronin Awards webinar series continues next Wednesday, November 10th, with Streamlining IT Hardware Procurement, Wisconsin's Collaborative Approach. For a look at the collaborative, data-driven process that allowed Wisconsin to develop new standard configurations for IT hardware, saving time and money. Registration is open for that webinar and all the webinars in the series. Visit www.naspo.org to register and look for the Webinars tab on the left side of the page. We look forward to seeing you there. At the close of today's presentation, you'll be asked to complete a very brief questionnaire. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO. Today's presentation is good for one contact hour. To get your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you would like to ask our presenter a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed during the presentation and with any remaining time after. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. We are honored to have with us Bachmann. He's the Assistant Director of the Office of State Procurement for Louisiana. He has 9 years experience in procurement, with 8 years working for state procurement. He started as an analyst. He then became a team manager before becoming the Assistant Director. NASPO is grateful to have you here with us. So now I'll turn it over to you, Austin.
Thank you. So today we'll be introducing you to our installment purchase market. This is a third-party financing program that we have available for our state agencies. I have some objectives we'll try to get to at the end of the presentation. You should be able to understand the features of the installment purchase market, identify any steps necessary to develop and implement your own project, and we'll also go through challenges and benefits of having this project. Before we get into IPM, we'll need to get some background on where we were in Louisiana. Historically, we've had 2 equipment financing programs available to our agencies. First program is the Louisiana Equipment Acquisition Fund, or LEAF. This is an internal financing mechanism. It's funds provided by our state treasury, and it's a $30 million revolving loan fund spread over multiple years. So it ends up being actually less than $10 million available in any one year. Payments made by agencies replenish the fund, and our interest rate is the Department of Treasury's internal rate of return, which for this year is now a little bit over 2%. But historically it's been between 1 and 1.5%. In addition to that program, we also had the Master Installment Purchase Agreement, or MIPA. This was third-party financing. It was available through a master agreement with a single financier. And this added $20 million per year in funding capacity to the state. Our interest rate was a margin that was set at award, added to an index treasury rate. So historical interest for this was approximately 5%, but with that indexed rate, it varied throughout time, but it was usually at least 3% higher than what we had available through LEAF. And that program actually ended in 2009. So in early, or actually late 2015, our Division of Administration or Commissioner came to state procurement with a challenge. State agencies needed the new equipment. The picture we have here was actually one of the vehicles running in our Department of Children and Family Services in 2015. But of course, that's a slight exaggeration, but our Department of Children and Family Services was driving 10-year-old vehicles and had massive annual maintenance expenses. They were probably one of the larger benefits of what we ended up with here. But there were many agencies that were in similar binds. So the agencies needed new equipment. They also lacked the budget for these equipment acquisitions. We had gone through several light budget years with tight budgets, and agencies just did not have any money up front to purchase the equipment they needed. To further compound the issue, LEAF had been depleted over the years. We had borrowed or loaned out too much money, and the program was was pausing new fundings until they could replenish the fund. And as mentioned, our MIPA program, the previous third-party financing, the program had ended in 2009. We had issued a new RFP and nobody had responded to it. So our challenge, our task was to reinstate MIPA. And after discussing with our commissioner's office, we were given a lot of leeway to restructure and improve the program. But in order to improve that program, we had to figure out why MIPA had failed. So as you may remember, there was some crisis going on in the financial markets in 2008. That may be putting it lightly. So an obvious answer, and I think what most people had assumed, was just we had bad timing. We released our RFP to renew the program in 2009. And it was just purely bad timing on the part. But as we dug in deeper to maybe some of the back or researching with other states, we found out that the financial crisis could not solely explain why nobody had responded to our RFP. As mentioned, the financial crisis was first hit in 2008. By 2009, banks had started lending again, which was around when our RFP opened. So we really needed to find out what about our program itself turned off the banks and other financiers. So what we found was that our MIPA program put too much risk on the banks. This was because we were having a firm fixed margin for the 3-year contract term. That led to a lot of risk for the banks, especially when the financial markets are extremely unstable. It made it very difficult for those banks to forecast their internal rate of return, at least how much they would make off of our contract. Okay. On top of that, our program was set up to where equipment wasn't known up front. So we would bid out to get a financier in place with a future equipment needs that we may need, but at the time we don't know what those are. So financiers couldn't see what equipment they were financing. We're asking them to give us a rate that was fixed for 3 years. Under that program, a financier could refuse to finance the equipment. It was at their option, but that was something that the financiers weren't really willing to do because they thought it would harm their relationship with the state. So that also added to the risk that they were having. Okay. That risk also had a compounding effect because it made the whole program extremely unattractive, both to the agencies and the financiers. So the risk results in higher rates. So that's how the banks respond to the risk. And those higher rates also made the agencies not want to use the program. So instead of buying equipment that they needed, they just held on to what they had and waited and hoped that they would have LEAF funding available. So that combination of being an unattractive offering and having too much risks led to no lenders responding to our RFP. So with that in hand, we went out and surveyed a market basket of states to see how they were doing third-party financing. What we found is there are two kind of general ways that states are setting up their financing program. The first one is through a master agreement, similar to what we had in MIPA. This is where you put out a bid, you get a single financier for a set term. Ours is 3, other states were 5 or 7 years. The interest rate is charged as a fixed margin on top of an index, almost universally. And then all the state's financing needs would flow through this single financier. Usually within this, financier has to approve each request. And one of the features of this is that it's a stable program. You know who your financier is going to be. You know what the program's rules are. You've got your terms and conditions already set. You know what the interest rate's going to be, or at least how you're going to calculate it, and things like that. But it's not flexible really at all. For instance, what do you do if the financier rejects an application from an agency? Does that agency just not purchase their equipment? Do they have to find another way to finance their equipment? What do you do if you have large market fluctuations, which could cause your financier to decide they're not lending any money? And also, from what we learned with the 2008, where we had some of these large financing companies go out of business completely. What happens if your single financier goes out of business? The other way that states were arranging their financing was bidding financing for each equipment purchase, or maybe on a set schedule, where they would get applications in from agencies, and every 6 months or so they would say, here are all of our needs, and bid those out. This method does lead to less risk for the financiers. So their interest rate risk is lower because the funding date is closer to the award date of the financing. It's also flexible in that that the financier is approving the equipment because they're submitting a bid. But it's not stable. You don't know who's going to submit a bid. You might not have a relationship with that winner, especially a long-term relationship. You may get lucky and have that long-term relationship, but you might not. And then it also carries high administrative costs. You're going to have to negotiate financing agreements potentially every time you award a bid. You might constantly be onboarding new suppliers, and all these things increase the costs of the program overall. So after our research, we came up with our goals. What we really wanted to do is have a stable program with the flexibility. So we wanted to combine those two traditional methods that we found. And while doing it, we wanted to reduce financier risk as much as we could. That was something we really focused on. Every facet of the program that we looked at, we looked for ways to actively reduce that risk for the lending institutions so that they could offer us the best rate they possibly could. as it turns out, in looking at some of the rates that we've ended up getting, I think we've reduced the risk to nearly zero. Okay. So the result of that was the installment purchase market. What we have set up is a pool of financiers. This is what we call the market. They provide stability in this pool, and it also lowers our administrative costs. What it sets up is a pre-existing relationship with anyone that we might end up doing this business with. So we know who our market members are. We are constantly in communication with them. And so we've developed this trust between the state and the suppliers that helps out with when it comes time for them to provide us, $10 million, for instance. Within this pool, we have pre-negotiated financing agreements with each member. These financing agreements are mostly the same, and they actually are functionally the same, but we did allow deviations between the members. We wanted them to be able to put in specific language to their bank where it didn't cause any advantage when we got to our second stage of financing. Within the market, we have our interest rate bids, which is how we finance the equipment itself. And this is where our flexibility comes in. So we receive interest rates from the banks in these interest rate bids, which allows those members to offer their best rates at that moment in time based on the current market conditions, short-term market projections, and each institution's current lending portfolio. So what we found is that by doing these periodic interest rate bids, we're getting the absolute best interest rate that each bank can offer at that point in time. The interest rate bids also allow the financiers to see which equipment they're financing up front. That recognizes that the different financiers may be able to offer a different rate on vehicles than on IT equipment, for instance. But all of this serves to lower their risk, and it ends up reducing the state's rate. So it really has created this win-win situation for us. Go into a little bit more details on the installment purchase market. So our financiers qualify as market members through an RFP. The program is meant to be perpetual, so we didn't want it to run 5 years and then have to completely, refresh everything every 5 years. So we issue an RFP about every 1.5 years, which will allow additional members to join in. And then as the original members' 5-year contracts will end up, they'll be able to pre-qualify through one of these RFPs as well, re-qualify, that is. Agencies submit applications to the Division of Administration's Office of Finance and Support Services. We call them OFSS. They approve for both IPM and LEAF. So we've combined it into a single application to make it easy on our agencies. When they send in, they're just sending in a request to, excuse me, turn my phone to do not disturb. They send in a request for financing. They don't know necessarily which program it's going to go through. All of that's decided by OFSS. So those approvals are sent to state procurement every month. For the interest rate bids, they are combined into bundles to make the equipment more attractive. And we'll get into exactly how we do those bundles a little later. But those bundles are then presented to our market members through an interest rate bids. The market members submit their interest rates, and then the lowest interest rate per bundle wins. So that results in a multiple award potential in each interest rate bid, presuming that there are multiple bundles. We have had several of our interest rate bids will just have a single bundle within them. So a little visual on kind of what that looks like. The darker blue here would represent the market itself. And then we'll have multiple interest rate bids. Again, we're doing that every other month. And each interest rate bid will have a different number of equipment bundles, just depending on what the state agency's needs are at that point in time. The foundation of the program is a series of contracts. Our first contract that governs the overall program itself is our market member contract. This is a 5-year straight contract term that allows the contract holder to participate in the program itself. It's signed by state procurement and that market member. And this contract just outlines the program. So it discusses how award of the interest rate bids will be made, how much notice we're going to provide when we issue an interest rate bid, the financing terms that are available in the program, how we're going to determine the interest rates, which index we're going to use, and also that the negotiation of the financing agreements is only done, upfront. We're not going to negotiate those following a bid. It also provides the market members' responsibilities. Mainly theirs, we just want active participation in our program. We don't want somebody qualifying for the program, becoming a market member, and then we never hear from them again. So with that, we have a requirement that all of our market members have to submit a bid or a no bid on at least 25% of interest rate bids each year. So at the least, that's going to be roughly 1 or 2 per year, based on how many we've currently sending out. This has not been a problem in our program, but it was something we were worried about up front. As it turns out, all of our market members have submitted bids on every single bundle that we've issued through the program. So the market member contract governs the entire program. The financing agreements govern the actual financing transaction. And we sign at least one financing agreement with each interest rate bid that goes out. This financing agreement is signed by our OFSS and the winning market member. And it outlines the responsibilities regarding the financial transactions. So things such as when interest will begin accruing, payment terms, who's responsible for the amortization schedule, and things like that. And then we have exhibits within the equipment schedule that describe the equipment that's being financed. There's an opinion of counsel that states that the state's allowed to legally do what we're doing. That's one thing the banks all required. And the most important exhibit that we have is our equipment and payment schedule. This is the third contract, if you will, that kind of runs the entire program. The equipment and payment schedule is executed by the using the agency that's procuring the equipment. And what it does is it binds that agency to the terms of the financing agreement. It also sets the funding date and locks in the interest rate itself for each equipment delivery. So we have one market member contract per financing institution. With each interest rate bid, you may have one or more financing agreements. The most we've had so far is 2. And then within each financing agreement, you'll have potentially multiple equipment schedules, depending on how many agencies are part of the funding, when the equipment's going to be delivered, and things like that may result in additional equipment schedules. Some additional features and what really help us, at least administratively, is that this program does not require bond commission approval in our state. And that's because it's not backed by the full faith and credit of the state. And what that means is that the program has no impact on the state's bond or credit rating. And really that comes in because there's no monetary penalty for failure to pay. If an agency doesn't pay or make their payments, their equipment is repossessed with no monetary penalty, as we mentioned. So essentially at that time, it'd be just a clean break between the financing institution and the state. Financier gets their equipment back, well, not their equipment, they get the state's equipment, and they get to keep all the payments that were made to that point. We also have a fiscal funding clause included in each financing agreement. So this kind of goes back to the no payment equals repossession as well. If funding's not available, we give notice to the financier and they come and get the equipment. The title passes to them and no penalty accrues to the state agency. All of the equipment that goes through the program must be movable equipment. Essentially what the way to think about that is it must be able to be repossessed without damaging the equipment. That doesn't mean it has to be easily repossessed, just that there has to be a possibility of removing it from wherever it is without damaging the equipment. So this is going to include things like vehicles, IT equipment, kitchen equipment, construction equipment. As we've had further discussions with these banks, it really can include almost anything that you would buy and has, you know, tangible value. But things that wouldn't be able to go through the program would be something like a chiller plant or borderline things would be even HVAC equipment that may be become part of a permanent fixture in a building. Those are kind of borderline. Okay. Because of the bundle feature that we have, there is no minimum equipment value that an agency must meet in order to submit their application. So even a small agency who may not have the budget to purchase a single vehicle can use the program. Even if that single vehicle they want is only maybe $15,000 or $20,000, they can still submit an application, be approved, and be combined into a larger bundle. Some additional features is that the state owns the equipment at equipment acquisition. So this isn't something where our financiers own the equipment and we're essentially leasing it from them. We own the equipment right up front, and the financiers can file a lien at their option, but the title is held by the state. Got my bullets a little out of order here at the last second, but we can also finance up to 25% soft costs. With this, soft costs are going to be things like installation, training, wiring, things like that don't really have much value on their own, or maybe are intangible items, but that might be needed for the equipment. So that cost of the soft cost cannot exceed 25% of the cost of the equipment. We do try to avoid financing any of the soft costs because it can have a result in us being kind of upside down on the loan, where the value of the loan exceeds the value of the equipment itself. But it is available, particularly where an agency might not have the money to pay for installation, for instance. We don't want a situation where the agency can only afford to purchase the equipment but not install it. We have 3 available finance terms, 36 months or 3 years, 60 months or 5 years, and 84 months or 7 years. We actually have yet to do a 7-year term, and we're about evenly split between 3 and 5 years. It seems to depend on the agency as to which one they prefer. We use the ICE benchmark index. This is a publicly available index. It's not behind a paywall. You don't even have to log in to go view it. and it's published almost daily. They have had periods where IC hasn't updated the index, and we've had some situations where we've had to rely on our financiers to tell us what the index was for that day. But one of the benefits, at least, of having this market is we can ask all of our market members to tell us what the index is, and that way we know they're telling us the truth because their rates will match. But IC has gotten better about updating their website more often. And finally, there's no prepayment penalty. So as agencies, maybe towards the end of the fiscal year, they'll have additional funding. They can prepay on their loans or maybe pay them off completely with zero penalty. One of the best features of IPM and what makes it really work well are the concept of these equipment bundles. And what those do is we're just grouping equipment together to make it a more attractive package. That helps us reduce administrative costs, both on their state side and on the financier side, because they're not having to finance, individual pieces of equipment. If we can bundle together, 50 vehicles for one agency, the bank's really doing it in a single transaction instead of having to do 50 different transactions. So when we create these bundles, we are looking at the financing term that's requested, the type of equipment that's being requested, and the delivery timeframe of that equipment. As I mentioned, we're trying to make a combination of these that gets the most attractive bundle for our market members, because that the more attractive the bundle is, the more the competition is going to be, the lower our rate's going to end up being. Excuse me. So when it comes to financing term, the interest rate's going to vary by financing term. That index changes based on which financing term you're looking at. So this really forces us into different equipment bundles based on that financing term. We can't have a 36-month and a 60-month financing in the same bundle. For the equipment type, mainly what we're looking at here is it a vehicle? Is it IT equipment? Is it construction equipment? And we try to put those similar to each other because we're recognizing that some of the financiers may have preference for certain types of equipment. Maybe Bank of America wants to offer a better rate on IT equipment, and Chase really just wants to finance vehicles. So by bundling them together, we're getting kind of that best rate they can possibly offer us. And that's also going to vary maybe by the time of year, or if Chase has a lot of vehicles already in their lending portfolio, maybe they want to balance that with IT equipment, for instance. Okay. We're also using this equipment type for our bundles because one of our goals as we expand out this program is that we want to bring in industry-specific financiers. So we want to bring in like IBM Capital, and we want to bring in GM Finance and Ford Motor Finance and things like that. And by showing that we're bundling things that's something that they might be interested in, or something that they only finance, we're hoping we're sweetening the pot to get them to respond to one of our RFPs and come in and provide even more competition for us. And then we also try to do our bundles by delivery time frame. The shorter the time frame from when we send out our interest bids to when the bank is actually sending the check and their interest, they start making their money, the better the interest rate we're going to receive because they're not exposed to the market conditions for as long. So we look at whether the equipment's being purchased off a state contract, and we will try to put those together because those are going to have shorter time frames, and items that we have to bid out separately. We try to put those together because they're going to generally be longer because we're having to add in the time, the solicitation time in there. Our goal is to try to get each bundle to at least $1 million. But we have had several bundles that have still had really great interest rates that have been less than that. I think the lowest bundle we've had was around $300,000, and it was still very low interest rate. So for sort of a visual on what these bundles might look like, here are some of the bundles we had in a single bid. This particular interest rate bid had, I believe, 5 bundles total. Just sort of chopped out 3 of them here. So you can see bundle 1 was a 60-month bundle. It was a little over $1 million. There were 2 agencies that were combined in there. So we took a 50 vehicle purchase that was at over $1 million, and we added 9 additional vehicles to it to get the number up even higher, because if we took just that agency 2 purchase and made it its own bundle at $186,000, we were likely going to get a lower or a higher interest rate. But by combining it with $1 million, it made it more attractive. Bundle 2 was also mainly vehicles, but it's 36 months. So we couldn't take this agency 3 request for 11 vehicles and combine that in bundle 1 because they were different time frames. In addition to this, we had one of our approved equipment was a hydraulic shear at a little around $63,000. We didn't have anywhere to really stick that, so we combined it in the bundle. We didn't want it separately again because the $63,000 financing was not going to be something the banks were really interested in providing a great rate for. And then our third bundle was also for 60 months and was nearly $5 million. It was for IT equipment. And it was from one of the agencies that was also purchasing vehicles. So this is an example of where we had combined, even though it was the same agency, we split into 2 separate bundles to get an IT specific bundle and a vehicle specific bundle. So looks like we might have a question. This might be a good spot to respond. So the question is, are we dealing with only national banks or local banks too? We have had some interest from local banks. They have yet to respond to an RFP. They still had a little bit of hesitation there, but we are in discussions with them. We think the next RFP we issue will have some of our local banks sign up as well. But right now we have 3 market members. They're all 3 national banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and US Bank are our current market members. Okay. So once we have our bundles created, we prepare our interest rate bid. In our interest rate bids, we're using a 7-day response period, and that's as mentioned before, that's governed by our market member contract, that we will give our market members at least 7 days to respond, which tends to be just enough because we do receive some questions occasionally that want more information about some of the specific equipment if we didn't provide enough there. But with that, we try to provide as much information about the equipment as we have in these bids. We want to be completely open, transparent about exactly what's being financed. So we've actually worked with our market members, shown them where they can go into our contract search and look up our contracts and find the specific contract items that we're trying to finance. And then the interest rate bid will provide them with the contract number and the line item and the exact cost for those contract equipment. When it comes to equipment that we're bidding out, we'll provide the specifications that we're going to use in our solicitation, along with the estimate that we've received as to what how much that'll cost. And when it comes to the bid equipment, if the actual cost of the equipment exceeds our estimate by 10%, by more than 10%, the financier who ends up winning that interest rate bid and the Office of Finance and Support Services both must approve the financing. So they'll both have to go in and approve the excess amount. We have yet to have that happen, but that is one of the features in the program. Our interest rate is that ICE index that we talked about a little while ago, multiplied by a tax exempt adjustment. The tax exempt adjustment is currently 79%, but we actually allow our financing institutions to change it just in case something, some federal law changes that we're not aware of. It would be picked up on the next interest rate bid. So it's the index times the tax exempt adjustment plus the spread or margin that the bank's offering at that point in time. I mentioned our awards are made by the equipment bundle itself, so you can have multiple awards from a single interest rate bid. Our interest rate floats with that index until the funding date, which is shortly after the equipment's delivered. The bank will send out this will be the funding date, and then the index for that date times the tax exempt adjustment plus the margin that was bid in the interest rate locks in at that date, and that'll be the interest rate for the entire term. So it's not a variable rate, it's a fixed rate, but it does float between when we get our interest rate bid in until the equipment's delivered, which is another reason why we want to minimize that equipment delivery as much as we can. Interest will begin accruing for the agency on the date that the financier pays for the equipment. So the financier sends a check to our equipment vendor, and on that date is when the interest will start accruing. And the first payment is due 30 days later. So we're paying in arrears. Some of the improvements we've seen, this is actually the same woman from that earlier photo that we had with her new vehicle, but not actually, of course. But what we've seen is that our agencies are able to modernize. So some of the things we've done is our Department of Children and Family Services has purchased an entirely new fleet. I think they're 150 vehicles that they were able to purchase. Our Department of Corrections has purchased some equipment, kitchen equipment that they needed, such as a bread slicer, a $50,000 bread slicer. I had no idea that bread slicers could cost that much. But we've also purchased a lot of IT goods. One of the things we've done is we financed a new mainframe that runs our procurement system, which has been a direct benefit to the Office of State Procurement. But we've also been able to purchase a lot of IT security hardware that we can use to harden our defense against cyber attacks. So that's been one of the really large benefits. We've increased our financing capacity by $50 million per year. And again, this other people's $50 million, so we don't have to worry about the funds running out. And then our accountants are also liking the program because our payments are spread over the lifespan of the equipment instead of a payment up front. So essentially we're matching the depreciation that they're having to calculate with the payments that we're making, which makes things a whole lot easier on that end. On the fiscal side, we're seeing some really large benefits here, mainly in reduced maintenance expenses. The Department of Children and Family Services, who was able to, had a very aging fleet, they've been able to eliminate their $500,000 per year bill that they had to maintain their aging fleet. So now they're only really paying for preventive maintenance like oil changes and things like that, because anything sort of big that breaks on the vehicles will be under warranty and they'll be covered that way. We're also reducing our rental expense. So some agencies that couldn't purchase equipment were renting it long-term. So we've been able to eliminate that now to where they're essentially paying the same or slightly less than what they were in rental expenses. But now they own the equipment, so they have something tangible there to take away. We're also able to take advantage of volume discounts that we otherwise might not have been able to afford. So instead of having to buy maybe, 2 mainframes at a time, if we can get a discount for buying 5, we can access that. And especially in today's economic climate, we can avoid inflation. So we can really push agencies to check that, if something's on contract now at a certain price and it's going to be bid out soon, you can go out and buy it now by financing it instead of waiting until maybe the next budget cycle where you can pay for it up front, but by then your price has increased. Okay. When we began the program, our goal was really just to have an additional option to lease. We were hoping to get the interest rate as low as we could, but we didn't have any thoughts that we could actually improve on our lease interest rate. But that is actually something that we're seeing here. Our average rate through IPM is lower than the average lease rate that we received over that same time frame. And it's growing in that gap. So to put another way, we're actually getting lower rates from banks than we're getting from our own treasury in this program. After the first year of the program, with that gap that we were seeing between our average rate and the average lease rate, we're projecting to save more than $2 million over the first 5 years of the program. And that's solely just in low interest rates. And that's actually going to accelerate because over the last 6 months, our interest rates have gone below 1%. Our last interest rate bid that we put out was in October, and our winning interest rate for the single bid we had in that interest rate bid was 0.8642%. So it's actually kind of significantly less than 1%. We had one that was hovering around 0.5%. And as we saw these kind of dip, we were so shocked that we were actually reaching out to the banks to make sure they didn't make a mistake somewhere and have a typo in their bid. But if that continues, obviously we'll be saving even more money. And if you bring in opportunity costs and everything like that, the cost of our equipment is actually lower in an inflationary environment. Let's see. I have a question. Do we have an enterprise leasing program? And if so, how does this program work in conjunction with it? We have a leasing program for computers, for instance, but nothing, at least as far as equipment itself. We made a decision rather than going for the lease on things like most of our equipment. It was a benefit to the state to finance it instead. So things like our laptop computers and desktops that will be obsolete very quickly. We're not financing that through this program. We do lease those, but things that hold their economic value longer are things that we'll put through this program and not lease those, because through the lease, we'll either have a balloon payment at the end to own the equipment, or we will never own it. So how do you implement this program in your state? Start off with, there are no Louisiana specific laws that we used. We are a model procurement code state, and we didn't have anything kind of special that we had to work around, at least on the financing side in Louisiana. So from that side, you should be clear. Your state may have different laws that may tweak things, but some tips we can go through is first to check, do you need approval to do this from somebody else? So that may be your bond commission, your treasury. Do they need to be involved? Second thing you want to look at is, does your state allow pre-qualification in a closed second tier in the procurement? Our interest rate bids are not publicly posted or advertised. All of those requirements were done through the initial RFP to create the market itself. So we have that closed second tier there with those interest rate bids where it's only available to our market members. And that's that's really necessary for the relationship that you'll build with the financiers, and to make sure you have those pre-negotiated financing agreements, because that's really one of the things that's going to save you a lot of administrative costs and a lot of time, because as we'll get to, those are a little difficult to negotiate. The third thing will be program management. When we were creating the program, we almost had the program management as an afterthought. So it was like, as things would pop up, we were like, okay, who's going to handle this part of it? And that caused some issues and delayed things that wouldn't have occurred if we had thought about it up front. So we actually had a 2-year delay between when we opened our RFP, or when we awarded our RFP, and when we issued our first interest rate bid. 6 months of that was negotiating the financing agreements, but the other 1.5 years was really trying to put in place all of the back office functions that were needed. So, and just some tips on things to think about is, how are your agencies going to apply for the program? And to whom are they going to submit their applications? As I mentioned, in Louisiana, they're sending them to our Office of Finance and Support Services within our Division of Administration with a single application. But in your state, that may be the Treasury or somebody else that's involved. It may even be your procurement office, if that's something that's within your purview. You're also going to want to go through who's going to create the bundles. In Louisiana, again, that's with state procurement, because we are in a better position to understand the equipment. And we've really dug into like what impacts our interest rate. So we've used some of our finance knowledge to come up with that. So we're creating the bundles. You're also going to want to go through who's going to issue those interest rate bids. In Louisiana, we have centralized procurement within state procurement here. So that's why we are issuing the bids. If we were decentralized, maybe our treasury would be the one issuing the bids and not us. And then also you're going to want to look into either, will you monitor agency payments? And if you do, who's going to monitor them? So our market members, our banks, know that OFSS is making sure our agencies are paying. They have somebody who's dedicated to the financing arm of their office. And, one of her main duties is making sure that the agencies are paying and that they're paying on time. We haven't had to use it yet, and hopefully we don't ever have to, but the OFSS also has the ability to actually take the money from that agency and make the payment if need be. So that helps our members know that they're going to get paid, they're going to get paid on time. But I think we've got a little bit like a peer pressure type of situation as well, because our agencies know how much the program's benefiting them. And they also know what's going to happen if they're not paying, or if they're paying late. In addition to just harming them, it's going to cause the rates for everyone to increase. And no agency wants to be the one responsible for that. So that's, we haven't had any issues with that, but having that oversight is something you probably definitely are going to want to have a single agency who's making sure all the other agencies are doing what they need to do. Once you've worked through all of that, it becomes pretty simple. You issue your RFP to create the market, and then you negotiate. And if you're anything like mine, the negotiation is going to be one of the toughest negotiations you've done. I thought IT companies were bad until I tried to negotiate with three banks simultaneously. Our market member contract negotiation, that took less than a week. It was very easy, straightforward. But then when it came down to the nuances of financing agreements, it took 6 months. And a lot of that was because you have to consolidate the red lines that are coming in from the different banks and making sure that you're not giving an advantage to one member over another. That's going to allow them to offer lower rates than somebody else. So with that, we were put in a strange situation where we were taking, some of the benefits that one vendor had negotiated into the contract and providing them to a second vendor so that they'd be on the same playing field. It's not something we've usually done before. Also, a tip here is to be flexible with your terminology. With states, we can sometimes be hard-headed as well, and we want it to say a certain thing. But it really helped out with those banks and helped make them partners by allowing them to make change and put it maybe in their bank language rather than ours. And then the final thing, once you've got all this into place, is you really need to market your program to the agencies. They need to be aware that it exists. They need to understand the benefits of financing versus outright purchase from their side. They also need to know the costs of what that is, that it will, maybe it will be more expensive for them. But if you're getting any rates like us, the slightly, the 1% interest rate maybe that we're getting in, it actually ends up being cheaper year over year because the budget's increasing by a higher percentage than the interest rate is. But the more agencies you can have in your program or actively using the program, you're going to have lower administrative costs that you can spread over more agencies. You're going to have higher benefits to all those agencies as well by having lower rates. So, do we have any questions?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I've got a few questions here. Forecasts predict the Federal Reserve could raise interest rates next year from these recent historic lows. What effect do you think this could have on the IPM and its usage?
We kept waiting for that, and they've been saying they're going to raise rates. So I kept expecting our interest rates to climb, but we've actually seen the opposite. And they keep dropping. So logic tells me that they should increase, but I guess until the Fed actually increases their rates, I think we're going to still continue to have extremely low rates.
What are the minimum qualifications, or are there minimum qualifications for financiers to qualify for the market?
So our evaluation factors that we looked at were the amount of reserve that each bank had. We looked at how many years they've been in business. Essentially our evaluation committee was actually all accountants for this RFP. And so they dug in, they did some of the current ratios and things like that to determine who was risky, who wasn't. As far as award, we set, they had to score 75% of the total available points to be a part of the market. Our first three were all, large national banks, and they all scored in the high 90%. But we actually had 94 technical points and 6 cost points in this because we weren't sure if Louisiana would allow us to do, if our procurement code allowed us to do an RFP that was only technical. So we put a very small portion of price in there as well.
So that kind of ties into my next question. How many financial institutions were originally awarded and how many are currently in the market?
Originally were 3. We currently have 3. We're in discussions with 3 more banks, 2 local and one national. They still had some questions last time we put one of our refresh RFPs out. So we're trying to go through where how this will benefit them and how the program works up front. For whatever reason, they're just very leery to submit the RFP. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also trying to entice the industry-specific financiers in as well.
One last question. You had mentioned that payments are spread out over the lifespan of the equipment, and that interest rate is locked in at the time of purchase. How do you determine the lifespan of the equipment ahead of the purchase?
So some of it are just general IRS rules, as far as, you know, how long you're depreciating things. But we also have some, like our fleet section says that the lifespan of our vehicles that we purchase at state is 5 years. So we also will pull that in. But really that's done up front on before the approval. So our Office of Finance and Support Services goes through that, makes sure that whatever they're using as the metric, it matches, and then before they even send it to state procurement to go out in a bid. So
Excellent.
they do accounting wizardry, I guess, up there and spit out how long it's viable.
Well, thank you. All right, everybody, that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenter, Austin Bachmann, for the valuable information he shared and for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you all for attending this webinar today. You will all receive a follow-up email containing today's slides. Remember, this webinar qualifies as one contact hour for continuing education. To receive your certificate, simply fill out the survey in your browser window once you've exited the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Questions entered into the chat and Q&A boxes have been saved, and we will try to follow up via email for any ones not addressed during the presentation. Thanks again to our wonderful presenter, and thank you to our guests. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Austin.